The Galactic Council chamber fell into complete silence as Ambassador Daniel Morrison walked up to the human delegation podium. Every alien species in the room stopped talking and turned their attention to him. For 30 years, humanity had been part of this council, and they had worked hard to help everyone. They mediated disputes between angry species, and they shared their technology freely with others. The 47 different alien races in the chamber expected Daniel to present another human solution to fix the current trade crisis that was affecting the outer regions of the galaxy. What Daniel said next would change everything forever. Daniel looked around the massive chamber and began speaking in a calm but firm voice. He told them that effective immediately, the United Earth government was withdrawing all diplomatic presence from the Galactic Council. Every human embassy would close within 30 days. All treaties that required human mediation were now dissolved. Humanity would honor existing trade agreements until they naturally expired, but there would be no new negotiations. The humans were done with the council. The chamber exploded into chaos. Alien ambassadors started shouting in dozens of different languages. The Vexari ambassador was clicking her mandibles so fast that her translator device could barely keep up. The Thorian delegate's scales were shifting through bright colors, showing his extreme distress. Chancellor Varric, who was a tall Xanthari with 4 blinking eyes, started slamming his gavel on the podium, repeatedly trying to restore order. Chancellor Varric's booming voice cut through the noise and demanded to know what had prompted this extreme action. His 4 eyes were wide with disbelief as he stared at Daniel. This kind of withdrawal had never happened before in the Council's long history. Daniel's face remained completely neutral as he explained. He said that humanity had concluded their participation in galactic affairs no longer served their interests. They had spent 3 decades solving problems for species that considered humans little more than useful tools. Humans had shared their technology freely and mediated countless wars and asked for nothing except basic respect. Instead, they were called primitive apes in private council meetings. Daniel revealed that humans knew about the exclusion protocols that deliberately kept them out of the inner sphere. Humans also knew about the tech suppression agreement that 17 species had secretly signed to limit what technology humans could access. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Several ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at their desks. Others glanced nervously at their colleagues. The secret coalition that had been working against human advancement had just been exposed in front of everyone. Daniel continued speaking and told them that humanity was finished with this arrangement. Humans would maintain their current borders, and they would defend their space with full military force, if necessary. But the problems of other species were now their own to solve. He wished them good luck and gathered his papers. The entire human delegation stood up and followed Daniel out of the chamber. Behind them, the council dissolved into complete chaos as species started accusing each other and arguments broke out across the room. On Earth, in the United Earth Government headquarters located in Geneva, President Linda Hayes watched the broadcast with her Security Council. Admiral Frank Carter leaned back in his chair with a slight smile on his weathered face. Secretary of Defense Patricia Walsh asked how long before the council members would start panicking. Dr. Henry Cross, who was the chief science advisor, predicted it would take about 2 days. He explained that without human arbitration, the Vexari and Thorian dispute would reignite immediately. The Outer Rim trade routes would collapse because humans were the only neutral party that both sides trusted to patrol them. The Krell expansion into the buffer zone would resume because humans were the only force keeping them in check. Linda nodded in agreement and said they should let it burn for a while. The alien species needed to understand what they had lost by taking humanity for granted. Across human-controlled space fleet movements began according to plan. Admiral Margaret Flynn received her orders aboard the massive carrier named Freedom's Dawn. 47 human outposts in neutral zones throughout the galaxy started their evacuation procedures. On the frontier colony called New Pittsburgh, Governor Jake Brennan read the withdrawal notice to his colonists, and they erupted in cheers. Many frontier colonies had been advocating for isolation from galactic politics for years. Not everyone was celebrating the withdrawal, though. On the trade station, Unity's Hope Merchant, Captain Claire Donovan, watched as alien crews started panicking while humans packed up their shops and offices. The station had been thriving for years because human merchants were trusted by all sides in various conflicts. Without the neutral human presence, old hatreds and rivalries would resurface quickly. Claire's first mate, Paul Henderson, stood beside her and muttered that things were going to get very ugly very fast. Claire nodded in agreement and said that was exactly the point. The alien species needed to learn this lesson the hard way. Back on Earth, Intelligence Director Kevin Marsh briefed President Hayes on alien communications that human spy networks had intercepted. The Galactic Council was in complete crisis mode. Emergency sessions had been called, and they were scheduled around the clock. Accusations were flying between species about who had leaked the secret protocols to humanity. Several ambassadors were demanding that humanity be sanctioned for this withdrawal. Chancellor Varick had pointed out the obvious problem with that idea. Humanity had committed no crime under galactic law. Any attempt at forcing humans back through coercion or military action would end very badly for the Council. The humans had been carefully preparing for this exact moment for 5 years. It started when their intelligence services had uncovered the full extent of the galactic conspiracy against them. Every possible contingency had been planned down to the smallest detail. Every vulnerability in human-controlled space had been reinforced with additional defenses. Humanity did not need the Galactic Council for anything. But as the alien species were about to learn the hard way, the Galactic Council desperately needed humanity for almost everything. The withdrawal had officially begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 weeks after humanity's dramatic withdrawal from galactic affairs, the first major problems began appearing. The Vexari and Thorian border dispute, which had been peacefully dormant for a decade, suddenly erupted into open warfare. Without neutral human peacekeepers monitoring the demilitarized zone, both sides immediately accused each other of violations. Warning shots were fired across the border. Then, real shots followed. Ships were destroyed and lives were lost. Chancellor Varick convened an emergency session of the Council, but neither warring side would accept any other species as a mediator. The Vexari did not trust the silicon-based crystalline collective because they believed those beings favored the Thorians. The Thorians flatly refused any arbitration from the Zenthari because they suspected economic bias. Within just a few days, the border war had expanded to include 7 different star systems, and the death toll was climbing rapidly. On Earth, President Linda Hayes received daily briefings about the escalating chaos throughout the galaxy. Her military advisor, General Richard Cole, presented the latest intelligence reports with barely concealed satisfaction. The Vexari had already lost 12 cruisers in the fighting. The Thorians had lost 15. Both sides were bleeding resources they could not afford to lose. Each side had sent secret backdoor requests for human intervention through unofficial channels. General Cole recommended they ignore all such requests completely. President Hayes agreed without hesitation and asked about the situation in the Outer Rim. Commerce Secretary Helen Wright reported that trade had collapsed by 63% in just 3 weeks. Without human convoy escorts to guarantee safety, merchants were refusing to use the main shipping routes. Piracy had increased by 14 times the normal rate. The Krell were taking full advantage of the chaos by raiding undefended shipping lanes. 3 minor species had filed formal complaints with the Council, but the Council could do absolutely nothing to help them. Dr. Henry Cross pulled up a holographic display that showed the entire galactic economy. Red warning indicators were spreading across the map like an infection. The ripple effects were actually exceeding their initial projections. 17 different species had relied heavily on human logistics networks to move their goods between systems. Those networks were now completely gone. Food shortages were being reported in the Dalmar sector. Critical medical supplies were not reaching the outer colonies. The Council was desperately trying to organize alternative solutions, but they lacked the coordination infrastructure that humans had built. On the trade station, Unity's Hope Captain Claire Donovan's dark predictions had come true faster than expected. With human merchants gone, the old rivalries had resurfaced with a vengeance. A fight between Krell and Thorian traders had left 3 aliens dead on the station floor. Station security, which consisted primarily of Zenthari guards, was struggling to maintain any kind of order without the calming presence of human mediators. Station Administrator Gex, who was a four-armed Dalmar, had sent his 47th request to the human embassy. He received only an automated response, saying diplomatic channels were permanently closed. In complete desperation, he sent a personal message directly to Claire, who had not left the station yet. Gex met Claire in her ship's cargo bay where she was supervising the loading of her final inventory. Paul Henderson was directing the loading drones, while Claire talked with the administrator. Gex begged her to speak to her government on behalf of the station. He reminded her that she had traded here for 8 years and knew everyone personally. Claire looked at him with sympathy but shook her head. She told him this was not her decision to make. His council had spent 30 years treating humans like junior partners, while secretly working to keep humanity suppressed. She asked him directly if he knew about the tech suppression agreement. Gex's eye stalks drooped in shame, and he admitted he had heard rumors, but did not want to believe they were true. Claire confirmed that 17 species had signed the agreement. They had all agreed to restrict what technology they would share with humanity, specifically to keep humans dependent on alien goodwill. When humans developed faster-than-light communications on their own, the council species tried to buy the patents through shell companies. Their plan was to bury the technology completely. Humans found out about that plot. Humans found out about all of it. Gex protested weakly that not all council members had supported those policies. Claire acknowledged that was probably true, but pointed out that none of them had spoken against the policies publicly either. They had all stayed silent and continued benefiting from human services, while their leaders conspired against humanity. Now they would have to solve their own problems, without human help. Claire's ship, the Wandering Star, departed from Unity's Hope 6 hours later. She was one of the very last humans to leave the station. Behind her, the station descended into deeper chaos as competing factions began fighting for control of the most profitable trading spaces and docking bays. In the Krell Empire War, Master Thorn reviewed reports of humanity's withdrawal with growing interest. The Krell had always been frustrated by human interference in their expansion plans. Human moral objections combined with their obvious military readiness had kept Krell territorial ambitions in check for decades. But now the humans were gone from galactic affairs. War Master Thorn ordered his subordinates to prepare the fleet for immediate action. He announced that the buffer zone was now undefended, and they would move to claim it within the week. His intelligence officer Vex, who was a scarred veteran, hesitated before speaking. He warned that the humans had withdrawn from the council, but they had not abandoned their military capabilities. If the Krell pushed into human sphere of influence, there would be consequences. Thorn dismissed the concern and said they would not push into human territory yet. But there were a dozen systems in the buffer zone that humans had claimed to protect. He wanted to test if humans actually planned to defend space that was not technically theirs. The Krell Third Fleet moved into the buffer zone 5 days later, and they overwhelmed the defenses of 3 minor colony worlds in less than a week. Desperate pleas for help went out to the Galactic Council from the conquered colonies. Chancellor Varric convened yet another emergency session. Ambassador Civ of the Crystalline Collective declared they must respond to Krell aggression immediately. If they allowed this to stand, it would set a terrible precedent that would destroy what little authority the Council had left. The Dalmar representative asked the obvious question. Respond with what military force? The Council Defense Force was a complete joke. It had always been human military power that provided real deterrence against aggressors. He asked if anyone present had the fleet strength to actually challenge the Krell in open combat. Uncomfortable silence was the only answer. In Geneva, Admiral Frank Carter watched the Council proceedings with grim amusement. He observed that they were finally realizing they had built their entire peace on human backs. Without humans providing the muscle, they were completely helpless against any real threat. By the 3rd month after humanity's withdrawal, the galactic situation had deteriorated far beyond anyone's worst predictions. The Vexari and Thorian War had expanded to 21 star systems. The Krell had conquered 7 buffer zone colonies with brutal efficiency. In the Outer Rim, complete economic collapse had triggered food riots on 14 different worlds. Governments were falling, and chaos was spreading. Chancellor Varric looked 10 years older as he convened what media outlets were now calling the Council of Desperation. Representatives from 47 species filled the chamber, but the empty human delegation seats seemed to dominate the entire room, like a gaping wound. Varric began the session by acknowledging their dire situation. Without human mediation and peacekeeping and logistics, support the systems that had maintained galactic stability for 3 decades had completely failed. They now had 4 active wars and 17 trade disputes that threatened to explode into additional conflicts. An economic crisis was affecting 83 worlds across the galaxy. Ambassador Civ of the Crystalline Collective spoke first and declared they must convince the humans to return. They should send a formal delegation to Earth and offer humanity substantial concessions to rejoin the Council. The Thorian ambassador immediately objected, and his scales flushed bright red with agitation. He demanded to know what concessions they could possibly offer. Full inner-sphere access, Council leadership positions. The humans would demand everything the Council had tried to deny them. Civ's crystalline form pulsed with urgency as he responded. Then, they should give humanity everything they want. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Their worlds were dying while they sat here debating. The Dalmar representative, Ambassador Kiv, raised one of his 4 hands and revealed he had been making unofficial inquiries through remaining trade contacts. The human response had been completely consistent across all channels. Humans were not interested in returning to the Council under any terms whatsoever. They were simply done. On Earth, President Linda Hayes met with her full cabinet in the secure Situation Room. Holographic displays showed the deteriorating galactic situation in real time across multiple screens. Intelligence Director Kevin Marsh presented the latest intercepted communications from the Council. They were in full panic mode now. 3 species had sent secret delegations to human border stations offering bilateral agreements completely outside the Council framework. The Zenthari had offered humanity exclusive mining rights to 17 resource-rich systems if humans would just resume convoy escort services in the Outer Rim. Secretary of State Gregory Mills leaned forward and asked what their official response should be. President Hayes said firmly that they had refused all offers. This was not about extracting concessions from desperate aliens. This was about fundamentally resetting the relationship between humanity and the entire galactic community. They would not be taken for granted ever again. Admiral Margaret Flynn had recently returned from overseeing the final evacuation of human personnel from neutral zones. She added that they were receiving thousands of messages daily from individual aliens. Merchants who had depended on human logistics networks were begging for help. Scientists who had collaborated with human researchers were pleading for resumed contact. Even some politicians who had privately opposed the suppression protocols were asking for dialogue. Patricia Walsh asked if any of these individuals were influential enough to actually change Council policy. Admiral Flynn shook her head and said, "Not really." The species that had signed the tech suppression agreement still firmly controlled the Council. Until those governments were willing to make real public accountability, nothing would fundamentally change. On the frontier colonies, the situation was more complicated. Governor Jake Brennan of New Pittsburgh faced a difficult moral decision. A refugee convoy carrying 300 Dalmar civilians had arrived at his colony's borders. They were fleeing the Krell advance and requested asylum. Jake called Governor Lisa Martinez of New Houston and Governor Stephen Burke of New Montana for an emergency conference. Lisa said the law was absolutely clear. They were not part of galactic affairs anymore. These refugees were not humanity's problem to solve. Jake countered that they were mostly children and families. New Pittsburgh had the space and resources to help them. Turning away desperate refugees when they could easily help would make humanity just as bad as the Council members who had abandoned them. Stephen, who was always the pragmatist, suggested a middle ground approach. They should help the refugees but make it absolutely clear this was a humanitarian action and not a political one. They were not resuming diplomatic relations. They were simply not letting innocent civilians die when they had the power to prevent it. After heated debate lasting several hours, they finally agreed. New Pittsburgh would accept the Dalmar refugees, but Governor Brennan would make a public statement emphasizing this was a local colonial decision and not official Earth government policy. When word of this reached Geneva, President Hayes was initially furious at the unauthorized action. Dr. Henry Cross talked her down and suggested they let the frontier colonies have some autonomy in these matters. It actually strengthened humanity's overall position. It showed they were not cruel or heartless, but simply done being exploited by others. They would help people on their own terms, and not because the council demanded it. The Krell expansion continued without any resistance. War Master Thorn had consolidated control over 7 buffer zone systems and was now preparing to push even deeper into undefended space. His confidence grew with each easy victory. The Galactic Council's threats meant absolutely nothing without human military enforcement to back them up. But Thorn made one critical miscalculation. The 8th system he targeted was called Meridian Station, and it had a human research outpost with 17 civilian scientists. When Krell warships entered the system, Admiral Frank Carter immediately received an emergency distress call. The scientists were requesting evacuation. In the Geneva Command Center, the President's entire staff gathered for an emergency meeting. General Richard Cole said this was exactly what the Krell were testing. They wanted to know if humans would defend their own people, or if the withdrawal meant total isolationism, even when human lives were at stake. President Hayes responded coldly that there was absolutely no question about what they would do. Humanity always defended its own people. Always. She authorized Admiral Carter to deploy the Third Fleet immediately. The rules of engagement were simple. Evacuate human personnel, and if the Krell interfered, remove them from the system with extreme prejudice. The Third Fleet arrived at Meridian Station 6 hours later. 15 powerful human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect combat formation. The Krell task force, which consisted of 8 cruisers and a dozen support ships, suddenly found themselves badly outgunned and outmaneuvered. Admiral Carter opened a direct channel to the Krell commander. He identified himself and gave them exactly 1 hour to withdraw completely from the system. He stated clearly that if any harm came to human personnel, he would consider it an act of war against humanity. War Master Thorn, who was monitoring the situation from his flagship 3 systems away, immediately ordered his ships to withdraw. He had wanted to test human resolve, and now he had his definitive answer. The message rippled through the entire galaxy within hours. Humanity was not protecting alien colonies anymore, but they would unleash overwhelming military force to defend their own interests. The Third Fleet did not just evacuate the scientists. They established a permanent defense platform in the Meridian system and announced that any approach within 5 light-years of human installations would be considered a hostile act. 6 months after humanity's withdrawal, the galaxy had descended into what future historians would call the period of adjustment. The Galactic Council existed in name only now. Real power had fragmented into competing blocks, with each group trying desperately to fill the vacuum left by human departure. The Vexari and Thorian war had ground into a bloody stalemate, with both sides economically exhausted. The Krell Empire now controlled 19 formerly independent systems, creating a massive refugee crisis that overwhelmed all neighboring sectors. In the Outer Rim, 3 minor species had simply collapsed completely, because their governments could not maintain order without the trade networks humanity had managed for decades. On Earth, President Linda Hayes prepared for what seemed inevitable. Intelligence Director Kevin Marsh had presented detailed analysis, suggesting the Council would soon fracture completely. Several major species were seriously considering withdrawal themselves. The system humanity had supported for 30 years was dying right before their eyes. Linda told her senior staff they had known this would happen eventually. The real question now was whether they let it burn completely or if they tried to salvage something worthwhile from the ashes. Secretary of State Gregory Mills asked what exactly they would salvage. The alien species had not learned anything meaningful. Humans were still receiving demands for help that completely ignored the fundamental issues that had caused the withdrawal in the first place. Dr. Henry Cross pulled up new economic projections and said there had actually been a significant shift in the past month. 8 species had issued public statements, formally acknowledging their role in the tech suppression agreement. The Dalmar government had issued a formal apology. The Zenthari had done the same. General Richard Cole scoffed and said apologies were cheap and meaningless. What mattered was concrete action. President Hayes agreed but acknowledged it was at least a start in the right direction. She asked Kevin for his intelligence assessment of which species were genuinely interested in reform. Kevin manipulated the holographic display and highlighted several species in blue. These were the ones intelligence assessed as genuinely wanting fundamental reform. They represented roughly 40% of current council membership. They were actively pushing for complete restructuring, including elimination of all suppression protocols and equal status for humanity in any future organization. Patricia Walsh asked about the remaining species. Kevin explained that some were stubborn holdouts or pure opportunists. The Crystalline Collective still believed they could weather this crisis without making fundamental changes. The Krell were openly hostile to any reconciliation. There was also a block of about 8 species more worried about maintaining their own traditional privileges than actually fixing the broken system. Admiral Margaret Flynn had been carefully reviewing military intelligence reports. She noted something interesting developing. 3 species had approached humanity about bilateral defense agreements, completely outside the Council framework. They wanted human military protection, but they were willing to pay for it with genuine technology sharing and resource access and real partnership. President Hayes asked which species had made these approaches. Admiral Flynn listed them. The Dalmar, who humanity already had positive history with. The Etherian Commonwealth, which was known for their advanced technology. And surprisingly, the Thorians, who were currently losing their war with the Vexari. The Thorians were desperate and had apparently realized their pride might actually cost them their entire civilization. Linda considered this information carefully and made her decision. She ordered discreet meetings arranged with all 3 species. Not in Geneva, where everything would be public. Somewhere neutral. She wanted to hear directly what they were really willing to offer humanity. The secret meetings took place on the human station, Freedom's Hope, which was positioned at the very edge of human-controlled space. Ambassador Daniel Morrison, who had delivered humanity's withdrawal announcement 6 months earlier, now led these crucial negotiations. The Dalmar sent Ambassador Kiv, who had been one of the very few voices arguing against treating humanity as junior partners. He arrived with a remarkable proposal that surprised even the experienced human diplomats. He offered full technology exchange with absolutely no restrictions. Everything the Dalmar had developed would be shared freely. Joint research initiatives with completely equal partnership. He also promised the Dalmar would support humanity's admission to the inner sphere with full voting rights if the Council ever reformed. Daniel asked the obvious question. What did the Dalmar want in return for such generous terms? Kiv was completely honest. They wanted help rebuilding their shattered trade networks. They wanted protection from continued Krell expansion. And honestly, they wanted to learn from humanity. They had watched humans operate for 3 decades and realized something important. Humanity had never needed the Council nearly as much as the Council needed humanity. The Dalmar had been too arrogant to see that truth until it was too late. The Etherian delegation offered something quite different from simple technology sharing. They offered intelligence. The Etherians possessed the galaxy's most sophisticated spy networks, and they knew everyone's secrets. Ambassador Lyra, whose telepathic thoughts were translated into spoken words, made an extraordinary offer. They would share everything they knew. Every secret protocol and every hidden agreement and every conspiracy. Complete transparency. They wanted to help humanity understand exactly how the Council really worked behind closed doors. That way, if they ever built something new together, they would not repeat the same terrible mistakes. The Thorian proposal was the most desperate, but also potentially the most significant. Ambassador Zek, with his scales cycling through colors of complete supplication, made his plea. If humanity would help them survive the Vexari War, they would become humanity's staunchest allies forever. They admitted they had been completely wrong. They had signed the suppression protocols because they feared human military advancement would destabilize the existing balance of power. Now they realized that balance had always been an illusion. True stability had come from human mediation, which everyone had taken completely for granted. Daniel reported all three proposals back to President Hayes, who immediately convened her full cabinet to discuss this unexpected development. Gregory Mills acknowledged this represented real progress, but 3 species out of 47 was not nearly enough to justify re-engaging with broader galactic affairs. Patricia Walsh disagreed strongly. She argued this was exactly how they should rebuild, but strictly on their own terms. They would not return to the broken council. Instead, they would create an entirely new framework based on genuine partnership with species that had actually learned the hard lesson. Admiral Carter added his strategic perspective. Alliances with these 3 particular species would give humanity considerable leverage. The Dalmar controlled key trade routes throughout multiple sectors. The Etherians provided unmatched intelligence capabilities. The Thorians were one of the most powerful military species in the galaxy. If humans helped them end their war on favorable terms, they would become a formidable ally. Dr. Henry Cross ran quick projections and said if they announced bilateral partnerships with these 3 species, many others would immediately want similar arrangements. They could potentially create an entirely new bloc that would eventually replace the Council completely, one built on fundamentally different principles. President Hayes made her final decision. She ordered formal agreements drafted immediately, but she insisted on including very strict clauses in all contracts. Any violation of technology, sharing commitments, or any attempt to suppress human advancement, or any indication they were reverting to old patterns, would result in immediate dissolution of the partnership. Humanity was absolutely not giving anyone third chances. 1 full year after humanity's dramatic withdrawal, Ambassador Daniel Morrison stood in a very different chamber than the one he had walked out of. The Summit Hall on Freedom's Hope Station had been built specifically for this historic moment. It was designed with input from 7 different species, who had signed what was now called the Alliance of Equals. The initial agreements had grown far beyond anyone's early projections. Along with the Dalmar and Etherians and Thorians, 4 more species had joined the alliance. The Helen Collective had signed. The Siran Republic had joined. The Nomad fleets had committed. And surprisingly, the Zenthari had broken away from the old council. The Zenthari's new ambassador Thorn had pushed hard for membership, arguing that his species' economic influence meant nothing if they isolated themselves from humanity's growing coalition. President Linda Hayes watched the summit proceedings through a holographic link from her office in Geneva. Her term as president would end in just 2 months. But this summit would define her entire legacy. The new alliance would not replace the Galactic Council through force. It would simply make the old council completely irrelevant through its success. Daniel called the summit to order, and all delegates took their designated seats. He announced they were gathered to formalize the structure that had emerged organically over the past 12 months. Not a council based on old traditions and hidden hierarchies. Instead, an alliance based on complete transparency and genuine partnership among equals. Ambassador Kiv of the Dalmar spoke first for the assembled delegates. He said the old council had failed because it always prioritized stability over justice and convenience over principle. They were proposing that this new alliance establish absolutely clear standards that everyone must follow. Any member caught suppressing another member's development would be immediately expelled. Any member engaging in unjustified military expansion would face severe sanctions from all other members. Most importantly, all major decisions would be made by consensus and not by the powerful, simply imposing their will on the weak. Admiral Margaret Flynn presented the proposed military framework for collective defense. The Alliance Defense Force would be genuinely multinational in structure and command. Each member would contribute according to their actual capability, but supreme command would rotate every 2 years among all members. Humanity would not be the default military muscle for everyone else's problems anymore. They would be equal partners in providing collective security. The Etherian representative Ambassador Lyra addressed the intelligence-sharing protocols. She proposed complete transparency among all members regarding any external threats. No species would maintain secret information that could affect overall alliance security. They had all learned the hard way that hidden agendas always destroyed trust eventually. Dr. Henry Cross outlined the economic integration plan in detail. Free trade among all alliance members with standardized regulations, developed collaboratively by all parties. The trade networks would be managed by a joint logistics command with permanent representatives from each species. No single species would control the flow of goods and services. The most revolutionary proposal came from the Thorian delegation. Ambassador Zek, whose species had been saved from complete defeat when human-backed peacekeepers had brokered an end to their disastrous war, presented the Cultural Exchange Initiative. He said that for far too long all species had maintained their separate isolated bubbles and only interacted when absolutely necessary. This alliance should be fundamentally different from that failed model. They proposed comprehensive student exchange programs and joint research universities, and even experimental mixed colonies where different species would live and work together daily. Not forced integration but organic relationship building. President Linda Hayes spoke from Geneva through the holographic link. She said these proposals represented exactly what humanity had hoped would emerge from the ashes. An alliance not just of governments making agreements, but of peoples actually connecting. What they were building here was not just another political structure. It was laying the foundation for genuine, galactic community. Back on Earth, the public response to these developments was overwhelmingly positive. The withdrawal had been popular among citizens, but this new engagement on completely equal terms was even more popular. News channels showed footage of the first joint human and Dalmar colony being established on a previously uninhabited world. Mixed crew starships were becoming increasingly common with humans, serving alongside various aliens, not as junior partners or senior managers, but simply as colleagues and equals. Captain Claire Donovan had returned to her trading career, but now she operated exclusively within Alliance-controlled space. Her crew on the Wandering Star was thoroughly mixed, humans and Dalmar and Helen all working together. On her ship, species differences mattered far less than simple competence and mutual trust. She told a visiting journalist that this was what the galaxy should have been all along. Nobody permanently in charge, and nobody permanently subordinate. Just different peoples working together because it made practical sense and felt right. Not everyone in the galaxy was happy with these dramatic developments. The remnants of the old Galactic Council, now representing only 23 species, viewed the Alliance of Equals as an existential threat to their remaining power. The Crystalline Collective, still bitter about humanity's withdrawal, had attempted to organize economic sanctions against all Alliance members. The sanctions had failed spectacularly and completely. The Alliance now controlled too much interstellar trade, and too much military power, and too much economic momentum. Species not yet in the Alliance were submitting applications for membership rather than joining any sanctions. The old council was dying, and everyone could see it happening. The Vexari, who were still slowly recovering from their disastrous war with the Thorians, sent a formal application for Alliance membership 6 months after the summit. The application included a truly remarkable document. It was a full public confession of their role in multiple conspiracies against humanity, including the Tech Suppression Agreement. It included a detailed formal apology drafted by their completely new government. The Alliance members debated the Vexari application seriously for 3 full weeks. Some members, particularly the Thorians, wanted to reject it entirely on principle, but humanity somewhat ironically argued strongly for accepting them. President-elect Senator Barry Turner gave his first major policy address on this issue. He said humanity had withdrawn to teach an important lesson, not to punish others forever. The Vexari had acknowledged their mistakes publicly and completely. They were willing to meet the Alliance standards. Rejecting them now would make humanity look petty and vindictive. The Vexari were admitted with very strict probationary terms. Their transformation from one of humanity's strongest opponents into a genuine committed partner became a model that other species studied carefully. The Krell Empire remained the major hostile holdout. War Master Thorn had been replaced after the Alliance made absolutely clear that any further Krell expansion would be met with overwhelming coordinated force. The new Krell leadership was more pragmatic but equally proud. They maintained hostile neutrality toward the Alliance. Admiral Frank Carter predicted during a strategy session that the Krell would eventually come around. Or they would isolate themselves into complete irrelevance. Either way, they were no longer the serious threat they had once been. On the second anniversary of humanity's withdrawal, Daniel Morrison stood in the same spot where he had delivered the announcement that shocked the entire galaxy. But this time, the hall was filled with representatives from 15 different species, all of them members of the Alliance of Equals working together. Daniel said that 2 years ago he had stood before the Galactic Council and told them humanity was done being taken for granted. Today, he stood before true partners and genuine friends. Humanity had not just rebuilt the bridges that were burned. They had built entirely new ones that were stronger and more honest than anything that came before. Ambassador Kiv approached Daniel privately after the ceremony. He said some of his people still did not understand why humanity had withdrawn so completely. They thought humans had overreacted to the situation. Daniel smiled and explained that humanity needed to make the break absolutely total. Half measures would never have worked. The galaxy needed to fully experience what existence was like without humanity completely and absolutely. Only then could humans return as true equals instead of as convenient tools. Kiv acknowledged that humanity had definitely succeeded, though he added quietly that the cost had been extremely high. Daniel replied that the cost of maintaining the old broken system would have been far higher, not just for humanity but for absolutely everyone. That system had been broken at its very foundation. It was better to let it collapse completely and build something real and lasting. In Geneva, Linda Hayes prepared to leave office. Her successor, Barry Turner, would inherit a humanity completely transformed. No longer the eager newcomers, desperately trying to prove themselves worthy of galactic acceptance. No longer the reliable problem solvers everyone depended on but nobody truly respected. Now humanity stood at the center of a new galactic order, built entirely on principles they had insisted upon. Equal, partnership, transparent governance, mutual respect, no suppression of anyone's development, no hidden protocols or secret agreements. Patricia Walsh asked during the final cabinet meeting if Linda thought it would last. Linda replied honestly that nothing lasts forever. But it was built on a much stronger foundation than what came before. And if it eventually did fall apart, at least it would not be because humanity allowed themselves to be taken for granted again. That lesson had been learned permanently.